Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in a country that had yet to define its borders or achieve internal stability. The United States was a young nation, riddled with territorial disputes, unequal economies, and a frontier where the law had limited reach. The constant movement of families, insecurity, and precariousness marked daily life. Lincoln grew up in this environment without regular access to formal education, his upbringing built on self-taught reading and manual labor. Before holding any political office, he was exposed to the violence of the frontier, the tensions between regions, and fragile institutions that did not always protect those living under their rule. His rise to public life was neither immediate nor straightforward, and was preceded by personal events and largely unseen circumstances that rarely appear in traditional narratives. Behind the presidential figure lie real, documented, and disturbing episodes. What were those chilling and tragic experiences that marked his life from the beginning? The assassination of his grandfather on the Kentucky frontier. Before Abraham Lincoln was even born, tragedy had already violently entered his family. His paternal grandfather, Captain Abraham Lincoln, lived with his family on the Kentucky frontier, a region still unstable at the end of the 18th century, where white settlements were encroaching on lands disputed with Native American tribes. It was neither a pacified nor a safe area. Daily life unfolded under the constant threat of attacks, ambushes, and reprisals. In May 1786, Captain Lincoln was working on his plot of land, accompanied by his sons. The scene was typical of the frontier: farming, constant vigilance, and weapons always close at hand. Without warning, a shot rang out from the nearby woods. The bullet struck Captain Abraham Lincoln, who fell dead instantly. There was no confrontation, no warning. It was a swift and decisive attack. The impact of that assassination was not limited to the loss of the head of the family. The event occurred in front of his sons, who witnessed the violence without any possibility of intervening. The border offered no institutional protection, nor an immediate response. The body lay in the field while the surrounding area remained silent, with no one knowing whether the attack was over or if the danger continued. This episode was etched into the family memory and passed down from generation to generation. It was not an isolated anecdote, but a constant reminder of the kind of world the Lincolns had lived in since their beginnings. Violence was not exceptional, but part of the everyday landscape. Death came without explanation, without trial, and without legal consequences. When his grandfather's killer tried to kill his father, the assassination of Captain Abraham Lincoln was not the end of the danger that day. After the shot that killed him, one of his sons, Thomas Lincoln, stood frozen before his father's body. He was just a child, unable to flee or react. The attacker emerged from the woods to check on the outcome of the shooting. The scene was clear: a dead man and a defenseless child just steps away. According to accounts preserved by the family, the assailant approached the spot intending to eliminate witnesses or take the child. In that instant, Thomas Lincoln's life was literally suspended. There was no negotiation, no time to escape. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but had it ended differently, Abraham Lincoln would never have been born. The outcome changed abruptly. Mordecai Lincoln, Thomas's older brother, reacted from a distance. Armed, he aimed and fired at the attacker, killing him before he could touch the child. It wasn't a planned heroic act, but a desperate and direct response amidst the chaos. The frontier offered no room for error or second chances. Thomas Lincoln survived through a combination of quick thinking and luck. That experience marked his childhood and shaped his adult character. Later accounts describe Thomas as a hardened, silent, and distrustful man, molded by a childhood where death nearly claimed him without warning. Born in an isolated cabin on the Kentucky frontier, Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in rural Kentucky. At that time, the area was still considered part of the western frontier. There were no permanent roads, no established towns, and no government structures capable of guaranteeing security or basic services. Life revolved around physical labor and self-sufficiency. His parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, were part of a wave of families moving west in search of available land. It was not a comfortable or planned migration. Conditions were precarious, and uncertainty was constant. The house where Lincoln was born was simple: built with whatever materials were available and lacking in amenities. The isolation was complete. Lincoln's childhood unfolded in this harsh environment. From a very young age, he was exposed to long days, manual labor, and material deprivation. Formal education was almost non-existent. Books were scarce, and learning depended on isolated moments stolen from daily work. There was no protected or stable childhood. Biographies agree that Lincoln himself did not romanticize his origins. He did not speak of his birth as an epic tale, but as a normal circumstance within a life marked by continuous effort. The frontier offered no room for nostalgia. Each day demanded practical attention and physical stamina. The journey to New Orleans, where Lincoln saw slaves in chains. When Abraham Lincoln was 19, he accepted a job that took him away from the closed life of the frontier for the first time. Along with another young man, he traveled down the Mississippi River on a raft loaded with goods bound for New Orleans. It was not a tourist trip or an educational one. It was a long, dangerous, and uncertain journey, where the river dictated the pace and any mistake could end in tragedy. During the trip, the raft stopped at small riverside settlements. There they traded goods, slept outdoors, and remained vigilant at night. At one of these stops, they were attacked by a group that tried to steal the cargo. The confrontation was brief but violent. Lincoln and his companion managed to defend themselves and continue the journey, knowing that there would be no outside help if anything went wrong. Upon arriving in New Orleans, Lincoln encountered a reality he had never seen before. The city functioned as a bustling commercial center, but also as a key point in the slave system. In the streets and markets, he observed scenes that contrasted sharply with the rural life he knew. People in chains, separated, and sold like merchandise were part of the everyday landscape. This encounter was not anecdotal. Lincoln made no speeches or public statements at the time, but the experience was etched in his memory. The trip revealed a scale of American reality he had previously been unaware of. The river didn't just transport goods, it also connected profoundly unequal worlds. Upon returning north, Lincoln resumed a modest life, but he was no longer the same. He had witnessed firsthand the violence, the law of the strongest, and a form of commerce that treated human beings as objects. It wasn't an isolated incident or a mere youthful endeavor. It was direct exposure to a system that operated in broad daylight and that would later reappear in other forms in his public decisions. When Lincoln prevented the execution of a Native American in 1832, Abraham Lincoln enlisted in the militia during the conflict known as the Black Hawk War. He was elected captain by his own men, a rare honor for someone without prior military experience. Although he did not participate in direct combat, his time in the war was neither irrelevant nor superficial. The conflict pitted the U.S. Army against a coalition of Native American tribes resisting the loss of their lands. The campaign was marked by forced displacements, irregular violence, and summary executions. Lincoln witnessed this climate from within, observing how quick decisions were made in an environment where the rule of law was fragile and human life held little value. In one of the most memorable episodes, Lincoln intervened to prevent an elderly Native American man from being executed by the militia. The man had been captured, and some soldiers were demanding his immediate death. Lincoln physically stood in his way, refusing to allow the lynching. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a direct action that created tension among his own men. The episode didn't make him a hero, nor was it widely publicized at the time. It didn't change the course of the war either, but it left a clear mark on his life. Lincoln understood that authority isn't always exercised by obeying the majority, and that command involves bearing personal costs when stopping an immediate injustice. When the conflict ended, Lincoln returned to civilian life without military glory. There were no victories to celebrate, no epic stories to tell. However, the experience exposed him to a stark reality. Armed power can easily spiral out of control when there are no clear limits or controls. That lesson wouldn't fade with time. The death of 3 children in the family. Abraham Lincoln's family life was marked by repeated losses, long before he occupied the White House. After marrying Mary Todd, they formed a family that, from the beginning, was marked by fragility. They had 4 children, all sons. Only one would reach adulthood. The first to die was Eddie, at just 4 years old. The illness progressed rapidly and left no room for intervention. The house fell silent, and the loss deeply affected both parents. Years later, when Lincoln was already serving as president, tragedy struck again. 11-year-old Willie became seriously ill and died in the presidential residence. Willie's death occurred in the midst of national conflict. While the country bled in the Civil War, Lincoln faced a profound and personal loss that he could not delegate. He continued with his public duties, but the blow was evident. Family routines were disrupted, and the atmosphere in the house became heavy and somber. The third son, Tad, survived the war but died years later, still young. Only Robert, the eldest, reached adulthood and had children. The succession of deaths was not presented as a tragic public narrative at the time, but it had a real and cumulative impact. The presidency did not shield Lincoln from domestic grief. Authority, office, and national responsibility coexisted with private funerals and empty rooms. Loss was not an isolated event, but a constant that accompanied his adult life and unfolded far from speeches, battles, and official records, opposing the war that ended his political career. When Abraham Lincoln arrived at the United States Congress, the country was embroiled in a new armed conflict. The war against Mexico had begun and enjoyed widespread political and popular support. For many legislators, opposing it was tantamount to signing their own political death warrant. Lincoln decided to do so anyway. From his seat as representative for Illinois, Lincoln openly questioned the origin of the conflict. He challenged not only the military strategy, but the very legitimacy of the war. He demanded to know precisely where American blood had been shed to justify the intervention. His objections were not well received. In an atmosphere of patriotic fervor, his words sounded awkward and out of place. The backlash was swift. His stance cost him support within his own party and left him isolated in Congress. When his term ended, Lincoln realized that insisting on another candidacy would be futile. There was no political space for someone who had defied a people's war. He decided not to seek re-election. The return to private life was not a strategic retreat, but a direct consequence of his position. He resumed practicing law, far from the national spotlight. During this time, his name almost completely disappeared from the political scene. There were no heroic speeches or belated accolades. This episode revealed a recurring theme. Lincoln was willing to accept personal losses when he believed a decision was wrong. At that moment, history did not immediately vindicate him. His refusal did not change the course of the war or alter its outcome. The only thing that changed was his own political destiny, which remained in limbo for years. Why he was respected in Mexico. While many American leaders were viewed with suspicion south of the Rio Grande, Abraham Lincoln held a distinct place in Mexican memory. This perception arose not from symbolic gestures or diplomatic speeches, but from concrete decisions made at key moments. The first reason was his public opposition to the war against Mexico while still a congressman. In a period when territorial expansion was celebrated as a national triumph, Lincoln questioned an intervention that ended with the loss of vast Mexican territories. This stance was recorded and did not go unnoticed outside the United States. Years later, as president, Lincoln supported the government of Benito Juárez during the French intervention in Mexico. While European powers attempted to impose a foreign regime, Lincoln maintained his support for the legitimacy of the Mexican Republican government. This was not a direct military alliance, but a clear political stance. This support was valued in Mexico as a sign of respect for its sovereignty. Over time, Lincoln's image became associated with a different vision of the United States, one less focused on imposition and more on defending legitimate governments. For this reason, his name began to appear on Mexican monuments and public spaces. This respect didn't stem from a campaign or a cultural strategy. It was the cumulative result of decisions made in adverse circumstances, when supporting Mexico offered no immediate benefits. Lincoln never sought this recognition. It came later as an unexpected consequence of stances that, at the time, had caused him more problems than advantages. The first national nomination he lost. Before being considered a presidential contender, Abraham Lincoln suffered a defeat that went almost unnoticed outside political circles. In 1856, during the first national convention of the newly formed Republican Party, his name was put forward for the vice presidential nomination. The convention brought together figures with more experience, more connections, and clearly greater political clout. Lincoln was not the favorite. His national experience was limited, and his fame rested more on his oratory than on significant executive positions. When the votes were cast, he lost the nomination. The setback was neither scandalous nor humiliating. It simply confirmed that the time was not yet right. The party chose another candidate who would ultimately lose the general election. For Lincoln, the episode had two effects. The first was obvious. He did not get the nomination. The second was more subtle. His name was registered as a serious option within the party. After the convention, Lincoln returned to his routine without holding any national office. There was no public consolation or promise of a bright future. However, that defeat placed him in a different position. He was no longer an unknown. He had been evaluated and considered, though not elected. That precedent served as a silent prelude. When a new internal contest opened up years later, Lincoln no longer appeared as a complete surprise. The previous defeat had not weakened him. It had prepared him for the moment when the party needed someone who didn't entirely belong to the old structures. The convention, where he defeated the frontrunners. In 1860, the Republican Party met in Chicago to choose its presidential candidate. The convention was dominated by figures with more extensive resumes and greater national presence. Several were sitting senators. Others had governed important states. Abraham Lincoln didn't fit that profile. His federal experience was limited to a single term in the House of Representatives. From the outset, his candidacy was seen as secondary. He wasn't at the top of the lists, nor did he command the initial support of the most influential delegations. However, as the voting progressed, the frontrunners began to block each other. None achieved a clear majority. The atmosphere became tense and fragmented. Lincoln then emerged as an acceptable alternative for opposing factions. He didn't generate the rejection that other candidates provoked and was perceived as someone capable of uniting the party. His name began to gain support in successive rounds, not by forcefully asserting himself, but by holding his own, while the others wore themselves out. On the third ballot, the balance was broken. Lincoln secured the necessary delegates and won the nomination. The result surprised even many of his own supporters. The candidate who had arrived without the frontrunner label suddenly became the party's official nominee. The convention ended without any extravagant celebrations. The country was divided and the upcoming campaign would be contentious. But that day was etched in history as the moment Lincoln outmaneuvered politicians with more apparent clout, without resorting to any visible maneuvering. The victory was not a show of force, but the product of a quiet accumulation of support when all others could no longer advance. Winning the presidency without winning the country. The presidential elections of November 1860 unfolded in a climate of national division. Tensions between the North and the South had reached a breaking point. This fracture not only ran through the country, but also through the political parties. The Democratic Party, the Republicans' main rival, entered the race divided. Instead of presenting a single candidate, the Democrats competed with two separate contenders, each representing opposing regional interests. This division dispersed the vote and weakened their position against Lincoln, who led a unified ticket within his party. Lincoln did not win an absolute majority of the popular vote. In fact, the sum of his rivals' votes exceeded his. However, the American electoral system is not decided by the total number of votes cast, but by the allocation of electors. In this arena, Lincoln gained a decisive advantage. He won in most of the northern states, securing enough electors to win the presidency. The result was legal and definitive, but it left a sense of illegitimacy in broad sectors of the South. For many, Lincoln had come to power without representing a significant portion of the country. The election did not close a political cycle. It opened one. In the following months, several southern states began the process of secession. Lincoln's triumph was not celebrated as a national victory, but rather received as a sign of rupture. The presidency began under a latent threat that would soon materialize. The journey to Washington. Under threat of death. After winning the election, Abraham Lincoln was to travel from Illinois to Washington to assume the presidency. The journey was originally planned as a public tour, with stops in several cities and direct contact with the public. However, the political climate had deteriorated rapidly. Threats were constant, and the risk of an assassination attempt began to be seriously considered by his inner circle. One of the most sensitive points on the route was Baltimore, a city with strong sympathies for the slave states. Confidential reports warned of a possible plot to assassinate Lincoln during his time there. There was no conclusive evidence, but the danger was treated as real. Faced with this situation, an exceptional decision was made. The travel plan was modified without public announcement. Part of the journey was undertaken covertly, minimizing exposure. Lincoln traveled on altered schedules and on a different train than originally planned, under constant surveillance. Communications were monitored to prevent leaks, and only a small circle knew the exact details of the trip. It wasn't about projecting strength or sending political messages, but about getting through the journey alive. The maneuver worked. Lincoln arrived in Washington without incident. However, when the change of plans became public, the reaction was immediate. Rumors and mockery circulated, especially in the southern states. The image spread of a president-elect who had to hide to reach the capital. Some interpreted the precaution as cowardice, others as a sign of the level of hostility gripping the country even before he took office. The assassination attempt never occurred, or at least was never confirmed. But the episode yielded one unequivocal conclusion. Before delivering a single speech as president, Lincoln had already been treated as a target. His rise to power was not marked by celebrations, but by the need to move secretly within his own country. The presidency began under direct threat, and personal safety would become a constant concern from day one. The period when his friends feared losing him. In the mid-1830s, Abraham Lincoln went through a personal crisis unrelated to politics and public life. It occurred when he was still a young lawyer in Illinois, far from any national office. The death of Anne Rutledge, a close friend and family member, triggered an emotional breakdown that seriously alarmed those around him. Accounts agree that Lincoln fell into a deep and sustained state of depression. His behavior changed noticeably. He became withdrawn, quiet, and had difficulty concentrating on his work. The concern among his close friends was neither vague nor exaggerated. It was concrete and persistent, based on the fear that he might harm himself. Some friends took direct measures. They ensured he was not alone for extended periods and removed certain objects from his surroundings as a precaution. These actions were not symbolic gestures or common social customs, but rather a response to genuine alarm, later mentioned in letters and memoirs by those who lived through that time. The crisis left no public record and had no visible outcome. There was no formal medical intervention or public statements. Over time, the most acute phase subsided, and Lincoln resumed his routine. Even so, that period remained one of the darkest of his private life, endured in silence and sustained only by the intervention of those who feared losing him before his public career even began. The tariffs that deepened the divide between North and South. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the American economy was deeply divided. The North had industrialized and relied on manufacturing. The South, on the other hand, remained based on agriculture and the export of raw materials. This difference was directly reflected in tariff policy. Abraham Lincoln advocated a system of high tariffs to protect northern industries from foreign competition. This policy favored domestic production, but made imported goods more expensive. For the South, which depended on foreign trade, the impact was negative and direct. Tariffs were not an isolated technical issue. They affected the cost of living, trade profits, and the country's relationship with foreign powers, especially Great Britain. For the southern states, these measures confirmed the feeling that the federal government legislated in favor of the North. Economic policy thus became an additional source of resentment. It was not the only cause of secession, but it was one of the most tangible. While the North saw tariffs as a tool for development, the South perceived them as an imposition that threatened its economic survival. By the time Lincoln assumed the presidency, these tensions were already entrenched. Economic decisions were not made in a vacuum. Each measure reinforced the idea that the country was moving in opposite directions. The political rupture found in economics a practical argument that fueled the final separation: the suspension of habeas corpus. During the Civil War, With the outbreak of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln received extraordinary powers. The country faced an internal rebellion, and federal authority was at risk. In this context, Lincoln made one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency, suspending the legal guarantee of habeas corpus in certain areas. The measure allowed for the arrest of individuals without immediate charges or civil trial. The objective was to neutralize internal threats, sabotage, and conspiracies in border states where loyalty to the Union was fragile. The decision was initially applied in a limited way, but was expanded as the conflict progressed. The suspension generated strong criticism. Legislators, judges, and citizens questioned the legality of the measure. For many, Lincoln had crossed a dangerous line. However, the president maintained that the survival of the nation required exceptional actions. The priority was to prevent the rebellion from spreading. During this period, the executive branch accumulated unprecedented powers. Lincoln authorized arrests, controlled financial resources, and made decisions without the usual oversight of Congress. The country operated under a logic of constant emergency. This concentration of power was not presented as a permanent model. It was a direct response to a crisis that threatened to disintegrate the nation. The war forced a choice between individual rights and national stability. Lincoln chose to keep the country united, even if it meant sacrificing rights that, in normal times, were considered inviolable. The order that turned the war into a fight against slavery. On January 1st, 1863, in the midst of a war whose outcome was still uncertain, Abraham Lincoln signed a document that decisively altered the course of the conflict. The Emancipation Proclamation was not a symbolic gesture or an abstract declaration. It was a measure taken under the powers the president had assumed as commander-in-chief during the war. The decree stipulated that all slaves living in rebel territories were legally free. It did not affect the slave states that remained within the Union, nor did it immediately free all the slaves in the country. Its scope was defined by the North's military advance. Wherever the Federal Army reached, slavery ceased to exist. The proclamation transformed the conflict. The war ceased to be merely a fight to preserve the Union and acquired an additional, irreversible objective. Any future negotiations were conditioned by this decision. A return to the previous state was no longer an option. For millions of enslaved people, the document opened a real possibility of freedom tied to the movement of the armies. For the South, it meant confirmation that the war directly threatened its social and economic structure. For the North, it implied making a commitment that amplified the moral and political cost of the conflict. Lincoln did not present the proclamation as an act of idealism. It was issued as a war order, carefully measured and delayed until a military victory would justify its implementation. With that signature, the conflict acquired a character that could no longer be reversed, no matter how much longer the war lasted. Re-election. While the war remained unresolved. In 1864, the United States faced an unprecedented situation. It had to hold presidential elections while the Civil War was still raging. The outcome of the conflict was uncertain, and weariness was spreading among the population. In this context, Abraham Lincoln sought re-election. Within his own party, the support was almost unanimous. The Republican convention nominated him with minimal opposition. No strong alternative emerged willing to replace him in the midst of the war. Continuity was perceived as a necessity, not an ideological choice. The campaign unfolded in a tense atmosphere. News from the front directly influenced public sentiment. Each military defeat weakened the president's position. Each advance strengthened his leadership. The outcome depended as much on the votes as on events on the battlefield. Ultimately, Lincoln won re-election. The victory was not unanimous in terms of the popular vote, but it was decisive in the allocation of electors. For a fractured nation, the result meant a gamble on continuing the war to the end under the same leadership. The 1864 election did not heal wounds or resolve divisions. It confirmed a collective decision amidst uncertainty. Lincoln was re-elected not because the country was at peace, but because a sufficient portion of the population believed that changing course at that moment could prove even more dangerous. An electoral victory that did not mean unity. Although Abraham Lincoln won the presidency for a second time with a wide margin in the Electoral College, the result, masked a more complex reality. The popular vote revealed a divided country, where a significant portion of the population supported his rival. The difference in electors did not reflect national unanimity. The electoral system amplified his victory. Lincoln won in the majority of the states that participated in the election, while his opponent only managed to triumph in a few. This distribution gave him an overwhelming majority of electors, even though the margin of votes was much narrower. The war conditioned participation. In the rebel states, voting did not take place, and in others, the process was carried out under restrictions inherent to the conflict. The result was legal, but it occurred in an exceptional context that limited any simple interpretation. The re-election consolidated Lincoln's authority to lead the final phase of the war. It gave him institutional backing to continue military operations and advance toward the definitive defeat of the Confederacy. However, it did not signify the end of internal tensions, nor the full acceptance of his leadership by all sectors of the country. The victory was clear in the official numbers, but the country remained deeply divided. Lincoln began his second term with reinforced power, while governing a nation that had not yet resolved the fractures that had led to the war. The night of comedy ended in a gunshot. On Friday, April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln decided to leave the White House to attend Ford's Theater in Washington. The Civil War was practically over, and the atmosphere in the Capitol was one of quiet relief. The scheduled play was a light comedy, and the outing was not intended as a political act, but rather as a moment of relaxation. Lincoln arrived accompanied by his wife and took his seat in the presidential box. The performance proceeded normally, amid laughter and applause from the audience. No one in the theater noticed any unusual movements or signs of alarm. The theater was not heavily guarded, and access to the box presented no significant obstacles. At a particular moment during the play, a man approached the president from behind. Without warning, he fired a single shot at close range. The bullet struck Lincoln in the head. The attacker shouted a phrase in Latin and jumped onto the stage before fleeing the theater. It took the audience a few seconds to understand what had happened. The silence turned to confusion. Some thought it was part of the show. Others reacted when they saw the president collapse. The play stopped immediately, and the theater was thrown into chaos. Lincoln didn't die instantly. He was carried out of the theater as the news spread through the city. In a matter of minutes, the Capitol went from celebration to shock. The war was over, but the violence wasn't. The bullet had struck the president just when the country believed it had survived the worst. The funeral procession, by train, across the United States. After the initial ceremonies in Washington, Abraham Lincoln's body was placed on a funeral train bound for Springfield, Illinois. The journey was not direct. The route partly replicated the journey Lincoln had made years earlier to assume the presidency, but this time the purpose was different. The train moved slowly, stopping in numerous cities. At each station, crowds gathered to pay their respects. The streets filled with silent people, many of whom had never seen the president in person. The passage of the train became a collective ritual. The coffin lay in state at public buildings for brief ceremonies. These were not political acts, but formal farewells. The entire country seemed to pause as the train passed. Factories shut down, church bells tolled, and shops closed. The journey stretched across several states and covered thousands of miles. For days, news of its passage dominated daily life. The final journey transformed private mourning into a national experience. When the train reached its destination, the feeling was not one of immediate closure. The journey had prolonged the farewell and reinforced the magnitude of the loss. The president had died, but his absence had become visible throughout the entire country, city by city, station after station. The hunt and death of the assassin. After shooting Abraham Lincoln and escaping Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth began a desperate flight. Wounded in the leg during his leap onto the stage, he managed to leave Washington with the help of accomplices who provided him with shelter, information, and escape routes. For several days, he moved through rural areas of Maryland and Virginia, relying on the sympathy of those who still supported the Confederate cause. Booth believed his act would have an immediate effect. He hoped the president's death would paralyze the federal government and allow the South to regroup. None of that happened. Instead of chaos, a massive manhunt ensued. Federal troops, agents, and local militias were ordered to capture him dead or alive. The net closed in on a farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Booth and his companion, David Herold, took refuge in a barn. At dawn, soldiers surrounded the barn and demanded surrender. Herold came out. Booth refused. He remained inside, armed, refusing any negotiation. When he refused, the barn was set on fire to force him out. Through the smoke and flames, Booth was visibly moving. A soldier fired through the cracks. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He was pulled from the barn still alive but paralyzed. He died shortly afterward on April 26, 1865. The escape ended without a trial or a final speech. The man who had assassinated the president died on an anonymous farm, far from the stage and the impact he had envisioned for his act. The military trial and hanging for the conspirators. Booth's death did not close the case of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Federal authorities continued the investigation to identify and punish all those involved in the conspiracy. Several suspects were arrested in the following days, accused of collaborating in the planning, logistical support, or cover-up of the attack. The detainees were tried by a military tribunal, not a civilian court. The government considered the crime to be an act of war against the state. The trial was swift and harsh. The accused were interrogated, confronted with testimonies and documents, and found guilty. Among those convicted were David Herold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt. Mary Surratt, the owner of a boarding house where the conspirators had met, was also tried. She was accused of facilitating the plan and maintaining direct ties with Booth and his circle. On July 7, 1865, 4 of the conspirators were executed in Washington. The execution was carried out by hanging and was witnessed by civilian and military authorities. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by federal sentence in the United States. The executions were intended to send a clear message. The president's assassination would not be treated as an isolated crime, but as a direct threat to national order. The punishment was swift, public, and final. The case was closed by force, not by debate. Brothers-in-law who fought on the enemy side. The Civil War not only fractured the country but also tore through Abraham Lincoln's family. His wife, Mary Todd, came from Kentucky, a slave state that remained in the Union but was deeply divided. Within his own family, several of his brothers and relatives chose a side opposed to the president's. Some of Lincoln's brothers-in-law enlisted in the Confederate Army. They fought against the forces he commanded as president and commander-in-chief. This was not symbolic loyalty, but direct participation in the armed conflict. Several of them died during the war. Their deaths occurred while Lincoln was making strategic decisions that affected the course of the conflict. The contradiction was absolute. From the White House, Lincoln was directing the war against an army in which members of his own extended family were fighting. This fact was not publicly used as an argument or as a propaganda tool. It remained in the background, known in private circles, and documented later by biographers. The war made no exceptions for family ties. The situation reflected the level of division in the country. Loyalty did not follow simple lines. In the president's inner circle, losses were felt on both sides. The war did not distinguish between public office and personal bonds. The Secret Service Act, signed on the day of the assassination, on April 14, 1865, the very day he would be assassinated, Abraham Lincoln carried out his usual work routine. He read reports, held meetings, and signed several official documents. Among them was a law that would have an immediate tragic irony. Lincoln signed legislation authorizing the creation of a federal agency to combat counterfeiting. This agency, which would later be known as the United States Secret Service, had not originally been conceived as a presidential protection force. At that time, presidential security was neither centralized nor professionalized. Protection depended on informal arrangements and local agents. The law signed that day laid the groundwork for a permanent federal structure, but its initial function did not include the direct protection of the president. Hours after signing the document, Lincoln attended Ford's Theater without a proper escort. The new agency did not yet exist in practice. The president was assassinated before the law he had just signed could take any effect. The Secret Service began operating months later, after Lincoln's death. Eventually, it would assume the task of protecting the president. The irony is recorded in history. The man who authorized its creation died without ever benefiting from it. The friendship with Joshua Speed and subsequent interpretations. During the second half of the 20th century, some historians began to raise questions about the nature of certain personal relationships of Abraham Lincoln, focusing especially on his friendship with Joshua Speed. In his youth, Lincoln shared a home with Speed for several years, and during that time the two men slept in the same room and, according to the customs of the time, also in the same bed. This type of cohabitation, common in that social and economic context, was interpreted by some later authors as evidence of an intimate relationship, although no documents exist that describe specific acts between them. The debate unfolded between specialists who reviewed letters, personal records, and testimonies from the period to look for clues about the president's love life, and other historians who pointed out that the evidence is insufficient to establish a definitive orientation. The surviving sources show an intense and lasting friendship, but none of the surviving documents narrate sexual relations or explicit statements about his attraction to men or women. The lack of direct evidence and the absence of contemporary commentary mean that the issue remains a matter of debate among scholars and biographers, without definitive consensus. This controversy does not stem from facts recorded in contemporary accounts or official documentation. It emerged decades later in publications that re-evaluated Lincoln's personal life from perspectives that did not exist at the time. The topic, therefore, remains a historiographical discussion about possible interpretations, not a proven fact nor part of Lincoln's political or public trajectory. The only president to register a patent. Before becoming president, Abraham Lincoln faced common problems while traveling on the inland rivers of the United States. During one such journey, the vessel he was traveling on became stuck on a sandbar, a frequent occurrence in river transport at the time. Based on this first-hand experience, he devised a solution to help refloat stuck ships, a system of inflatable chambers attached to the sides of the hull that, when activated, would increase the vessel's buoyancy and allow it to be freed without unloading its cargo. In 1849, Lincoln formally presented his design to the United States Patent Office and obtained patent number 6469 for the device. Although the invention was never manufactured or widely used, the official recognition made him the only US president to register a patent in his name. His idea remained a technical curiosity and a testament to his interest in solving practical problems, without the invention becoming part of his subsequent political or presidential career. The beard, the photograph, and other presidential firsts. Abraham Lincoln's arrival at the White House marked several unprecedented events that only acquired significance with time. One of them was his personal appearance. Lincoln presented himself as the first president to wear a beard during his term, breaking with the previous Republican custom of keeping his face clean-shaven. This choice was not the subject of public debate or political strategy, but rather a personal preference that became part of his historical image. Another unprecedented event occurred during his first inauguration. For the first time, a US presidential inauguration was recorded in a photograph. The cameras of the time captured the scene, the audience, and the solemnity of the ceremony, fixing in images an event that until then had only been documented with words or drawings. Among those photographed was John Wilkes Booth, an actor with sympathies for the Confederate cause and Lincoln's future assassin, although at that time his presence was not considered relevant. The combination of the beard, the photograph, and the coincidence of attendees formed a set of firsts that, far from being celebrated at the time, were understood as significant only after the events that followed. The attempted body theft. 11 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination and burial in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, a plot emerged to steal his body for blackmail purposes. In the fall of 1876, a group involved in counterfeiting devised a plan to remove the president's body to demand the release of one of their imprisoned members and a sum of money in exchange. The plan involved removing Lincoln's remains from his grave and hiding them outside Springfield, hoping that the threat of keeping them out of place would force the authorities to negotiate. Some of those involved even traveled to the cemetery on a night chosen for the operation, when public attention would be distracted by other events. However, one of the men recruited for the action was a Secret Service informant and alerted the authorities before the attempt could succeed. When the conspirators returned to the grave to carry out the plan, the presence of agents and local forces prevented them from achieving their objective, and they left the site without completing the theft. This episode confirmed that, even after his death, Lincoln's image continued to be subjected to violence and exploitation, and that efforts to protect his remains would have to be intensified in the following years. The opening of the coffin and the condition of the body in 1901, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, concerns arose about the integrity of Abraham Lincoln's remains after the multiple relocations his coffin had undergone since its original burial. This concern led to the coffin being opened and examined in 1901 by a select group of witnesses who discreetly participated in the inspection of its contents. By carefully removing part of the coffin lid, those present were able to see the body. Its appearance was surprising due to the unusual preservation of its features, which still allowed Lincoln's physiognomy to be clearly recognized. The beard, hair, and some facial details remained perceptible, although the passage of time had produced changes typical of a body buried for decades. This examination was carried out with the intention of verifying the identity and presence of the remains before their final reburial in a protected sarcophagus. The opening of the coffin was followed by a new ceiling and reinforcement of the tomb to ensure the permanence of the remains, amid fears that future threats could put them at risk. Moving the body 17 times to prevent theft. Over several decades after his initial burial, Abraham Lincoln's remains were moved multiple times within the mausoleum complex where they rested. The coffin was moved repeatedly to different locations within the mausoleum and cemetery. Each relocation was prompted by security decisions and the need to reinforce the body's protection against attempted theft, exposure to potential unrest, or the construction of new structures. The relocations were carried out discreetly and without public ceremonies, with the aim of ensuring the remains remained in a place considered safer and more stable. Eventually, after 17 moves, a final location was established under a level of protection that combined physical elements and reinforced structures, bringing to a close a series of actions designed to prevent any attempt at desecration. These events are not a legend or an exaggerated version of the past. They are documented, they happened, and they had real consequences. Some were public, others remained hidden for years, but all of them occurred. The question is not whether Abraham Lincoln was a tragic figure, but how many of these experiences shaped decisions that still have effects today.